Hello and welcome to Longship Gaming. Today we're going to be talking about Frosthaven. How can you get more out of the game that you probably paid a lot of money for? Well, we've got some tips and tricks that we've developed in our playthrough of the game. Now, mind you, this is up to the end of the first summer. We've had a couple of retirements, and I'll get to that in a moment. But things that I think that people need to be aware of if they haven't yet jumped into Frosthaven, just to make their enjoyment of the game a little more. It can be daunting. It's a lifestyle game. You're going to be spending a lot of time with it. So why not get the most that you can out of it? So beware, there are some spoilers. I'll be talking about a couple of specific scenarios that we learned some things from, but not a ton of spoilers. Nothing really to do with the story per se, nor any unlocked classes. As I said, the inspiration for this was taken from our experiences leading up to the first summer. We've been largely successful. We've had some failures, but to keep your game running smooth, there's some trends that we notice, especially in my case, because I have a lot of experience with Gloomhaven, that it feels a bit different in Frosthaven. Things you need to pay attention to. But ultimately, whether you take any of these tips or tricks and use them in your own game, ultimately it's your game, and you should do what's best for you and your play group. So let's get into number one. Oh, by the way, I should have said Grizz the Blinkblade. So I wanted to couch this as saying basically here's the experiences of my, I've now retired, unfortunately, Blinkblade. I really loved playing her, but yeah, she retired pretty fast. She had a fairly easy retirement goal for her character. And hopefully you can see her. There she is, painted up, and I am sad to see her go, but I learned a lot with her, and I think Grizz here, she has a lot of sage advice to share with other mercenaries who are making their journey to Frosthaven. So to start it off, number one, if you make a mistake and it's too late to revert, ignore it and move on. So it's a big game. It's a very large rule book. There's a lot of nuance, and again, I'll further points down the line we'll bring this up. But there will be times when it won't be until several turns later, or even the next session, when you realize that you've made a mistake. So what do you do then? Especially if it feels like a rather significant one in terms of the flow of the game. So I'm going to give you an example. One of our players, we didn't read the retirement requirement on the card properly. Basically, it meant that he was able to retire that mercenary, the Banner Spear, way too early. But by that point, he had already gone through everything about retiring the character. All the cards had gone back in the box. He got the new character out. I painted the new one. So what do you do then? Because it was discovered, of course, before the next session. We try and play on a weekly basis. We just sort of shrugged and went, you know what? He would have been retired sooner or later anyway. It's not like, especially when you're prosperity level 1 or 2 at the time, and of course you're bringing in new characters only on prosperity 1, it's not going to make that much of a difference. And he gets to learn that character right from level 1. And we just continued on. It's not like the unlocked characters are any more powerful than the starting ones. So we just sort of shrugged off and went, you know what? We got to learn to read those cards better. And just kept going. Now, if it's a mistake that you've made, a really minor one in terms of like creature movement or monster movement, or how a card works, and your turn's not really done, it's okay just to revert back. Even if you've gotten through an entire scenario and you notice that you didn't quite move the monsters right, or things were sort of mistimed, I wouldn't worry about it. Just move on with the game. Continuing, take that rules learning moment, carry it forward, and then throughout the rest of the game, you'll always be mindful of it. So Grizz's advice, part number 2. Not every scenario works for every party composition. So For us, there's been a big shift between how Gloomhaven functioned and Frosthaven functions. There is more complexity to Frosthaven scenarios. It's not always just kill everything in a room, open the next room, kill everything in the next room, move it in the next room. In Gloomhaven, there was the occasional press the button or stand on the buttons or escort, or like a VIP escort mission, that sort of thing. And they broke up the overall flow of Frosthaven, of Gloomhaven, other than the just, go into room, bash monsters, move on to the next one, finish the campaign. So, one example I can give for Frosthaven is there will be times when movement is very important. The one example I can give, there's two actually. There's one in which you're trying to, the strategy seemed to be, let's get to the next room as soon as possible to clear some obstacles in the first room. But because it's basically a corridor filled with creatures, and not everybody had a lot of jump or a lot of movement tech, it was extremely difficult to fight their way to that door. And you're taking damage along the way, depending on where you land. It was extremely tough. And there will be certain party compositions in which you don't have a lot of mobility and you won't be able to get to that first door to clear the obstacles in the first one. Another example would be across the other side of the room, there's a giant icicle or something that you need to take out. Well, not everybody has that, again, that kind of mobility. There's lots of impassable terrain in the way. Your party is relatively slow, and it may fall on one character to get there as fast as possible and just press the button or smash the thing over and over and over and over again, and just make sure the rest of the party draws all the monsters to them. Again, unless you had a highly mobile character like that in your group, and your starting group is not always going to have that, that's going to be a tough one. So if you run into those kinds of scenarios in which your party composition actually seems to be working against you, it's okay just not to continue that one. There are a lot of scenarios. This, of course, ties into other points that Grizz would like to make about her experiences, but just be aware that your group composition may not be able to take on every scenario. Number 3, scenario goals are far more varied, so be prepared. So this kind of dovetails into the previous point. There's a lot more needing to get to a certain point to press a button or destroy a thing or outrun something. It's not just a lot of bash the enemy. You have to sort of think around just the usual let's smash things. Starting characters don't generally have very high attacks, so you're going to be spending a lot of time plowing through, doing minuscule attacks against relatively high health or, God forbid, high armor enemies. Concentrate really on the scenario goals. So each scenario has a complexity indicator between 1 and 3. Ones tend to, in my experience, tend to be just the sort of smash the monster sort of things. And the higher complexity, you will have a lot of go press the button, go stand on the spot. And of course, there's a lot of scenarios in which you have a lot of creatures spawning, forcing you to have to move forward. So you should always be working towards the scenario goals, and killing monsters in those cases is secondary. Unless, of course, they are significantly in your way and impeding you from getting to do what you want. Grizz's number 4 point is don't be afraid to exhaust to meet scenario goals. So this is something that Grizz knows all too well. Grizz the Blinkblade is not a very hardy, not a lot of hit points, and relies on evasion and doing high damage. A real glass cannon kind of character. Very speedy, but a glass cannon. There were many scenarios that speed and burst damage. So burst damage is where you can do a lot of damage very quickly, multiple attacks, and there are lots of ways for the Blinkblade to get that. Where burst damage, getting to a spot and doing burst damage is very important. It's happened on almost every scenario that I played with the Blinkblade, where there was something that needed to be smashed, whether it was chipping away at something over like 10 turns or however long it took to chip away at a giant icicle, or to get to some kind of structure on the map that needed to be destroyed as quickly as possible. That's where the Blinkblade came in. The problem with that, of course, is sometimes to get there, you will be taking damage. You will be taking a lot of hits. You will have to throw your lost cards out. And I think in about half of the scenarios that I was playing with the Blinkblade, Grizz exhausted. Either from usually not from damage, usually from running out of cards. And that's just because, in my experience, the Blinkblade was one of the most scenario-focused classes in the game. They look like they're an assassination machine, and they are. They're really good at it. But ultimately, they need to get to the place where they need to go, and they need to do the work. So don't be afraid to exhaust. If you've done everything you possibly can, dished out as much damage, it's fine to I mean, it goes for almost any other characters. There are many scenarios in which you don't have to all be standing. You don't all have to have destroyed every monster in the room. You just have to meet the requirements of the objectives of the mission. And sometimes it goes against what people may have been used to when playing Gloomhaven, in that kill the monsters, stay alive as long as possible. You know what? Even if one of you goes down, if you're playing with 4 players, you're still at 75% of players in the game who probably have far deeper card pools than deck sizes than the Blinkblade does. Grizz's next point is to prioritize looting. So looting, again, in Gloomhaven, it was money. That was it. Or maybe get a chest. But how Frosthaven functions is vitally important to loot as much as you possibly can in a scenario. You're not always going to have time to do it. I've noticed that most of the classes have more loot cards in general to suck up the loot around them. Loot is so important for us in Frosthaven because of the crafting, and more importantly, putting that towards building up the structures in Frosthaven. I cannot emphasize how important it is to get as many loot tokens off the board out of a scenario. There will, of course, be times that you're under time pressure, that you want to, of course, you need to win the scenario to be able to hold on to those resources to take them back to Frosthaven. If you lose the scenario, then you don't get any of them at all. You just keep the cash, but you certainly don't keep the token or the loot. Very important to prioritize it, but of course, not at the expense of failing a scenario. So to connect to that, crafting, point number 6, better than buying. You're better off. Things get expensive. Like the group will be spending a lot of money as well as resources building things in Frosthaven. I think the idea is that once you get the power of enhancement going, that becomes the real money sink in the game. Of course, there are buildings in Frosthaven where you can spend gold to get resources, which should never be overlooked. So there's always going to be some kind of money sink. But crafting is generally better than buying. You can, early equipment especially, only may cost 1 or 2 of a couple of resources. And then, of course, and this is not that much of a spoiler, there are crafting recipes that you may find when you're adventuring, or that you get from the that you can get through the craftsman as you upgrade the craftsman, that will require earlier pieces of equipment to then craft into more elaborate or more effective ones. So, crafting, focus on that rather than buying. Save your money for what you need it for, which is usually building. Unless there's something really, you have no other choice, and there's something really good, and you actually have gotten a lot of gold, because it feels like you do get more gold from these scenarios than you did in Gloomhaven, but it's going to be mixed in with, of course, with the resources. So, crafting, definitely better than buying. Number 7, start building up Frosthaven right away. So right from your first Outpost event, if you can do it. In our campaign, it was really funny because the first summer Outpost event we had was an attack, and there aren't that many in the summer Outpost deck. The very first one was an attack, so that kind of slowed us down. But yeah, right away, do what you can to start building up Frosthaven. It's so important to open up a lot of different aspects of the game, and also just to eventually get like a steady flow of resources in. Not to mention also, and again, not much of a spoiler, depending on what you're unlocking, and that's usually done through retirements, sometimes unlocking a structure will unlock another class. Once you get those, boom, start building those and upgrading those. You have a lot of leeway in the first summer to do this, because you don't. There aren't that many attacks during the first summer season. So there is a mechanic, of course, and this is important to realize. You can take a morale hit, losing 1 rank of morale, to build a second building after have the resources. So you should be at least building or upgrading something every time that you're in the Outpost phase. Rules questions. So, as I mentioned, the rulebook is very, very large. Some things are difficult to find. I found for our group the fastest way to do it, believe it or not, search for the exact search terms or situations you're looking for. If it's for a specific scenario or some kind of strange rules interaction, or how one of your ability cards works, or one of the class works, search for it, and usually you will find the answers on the Board Game Geek forums or on Reddit. I know it sounds very strange. And all of these things are actually in the rulebook, but the rulebook is massive, with lots of little nuance. Sometimes, especially if you're in the middle of it, don't really pause to pour through the rulebook to try and find it. It has an okay index, but it's not perfect. Do a quick search for BGG or Reddit, and you will usually find the answer. And it can reveal things that you may not have realized before. So I'm going to give you 2 examples. First one, again, I played a lot of Gloomhaven, but I never realized that. So this is the example number 1. We were looking up the effects of, actually I was looking up something completely different, and I came across a reference to pushes and how they interact with retaliate. I never played it that way. I always thought that all the effects in the attacks were simultaneous, other than, of course, the list of things that happen during the attack. So let's say it's an attack to push and then maybe a poison or something like that. Then that would all happen, and then all the things would happen from the creature side, like if it had retaliate. Well, that's not the way it is. Creatures do not, or monsters do not, or enemies is probably a better way to put it. Enemies do not retaliate if they are pushed out of melee range. Something I just, never, we always got into a pattern of play, and we discovered this through searching. The other circumstance had to do with, and I'm pulling a blank here. It was a pretty significant one. One thing that I never really realized about the X cards in characters' decks, I had always assumed that those X cards were basically just more cards that you could swap out when you leveled up. So you'd had access to all the ones, of course, on level 1. But that was it. That was your one. That was your deck. When you leveled up, you could choose from an X or a 2. Imagine my shock when looking up some other rule that the X's are basically part of the pool of cards you have in level 1. So if you have a hand of 10, so you've got your 10 starting level 1 cards, and you have the other X's that you can swap in for them. It blew my mind. That was always the case. That you always had ways to, before the scenario, choose from your available cards and make changes as you go along. I think that was because I had unlocked a class and I was looking into how to best play them. Yeah, I was net decking a little, but you know, sometimes a new class you want to get a good handle on them right away. And came across this idea of swapping out the X's into your deck at will. Blew my mind. Opened up a lot more play opportunities for the group. But again, that's 2 examples of rules that I thought I knew or had interpreted in a certain way for years through the games, and ended up sort of playing it more on hard mode. I'd rather play this game on hard mode that makes it harder for me than to have cheated and made it easier. Cheated. Again, it's a cooperative game. Who are really cheating? Nobody. Again, that harkens back to point number 1, which is if you make a mistake, just move on. Number 9, Grizz's best advice, and I made a video about this a while back. Minimize setup and teardown. So I have another video that I did about cheap ways of organizing. You have to recognize, and so here behind me, you can see how this is. I've got the cheap map folio. There it is. Cheap map folio I got from the dollar store, some bins from the dollar store, boxes, and of course the main box itself. Minimize how much time it takes to tear up and set up and tear down the game. You will get it to the table much more often, but also realize, like that stack behind me, it's never going to look good on a Kallax if you're playing with any regularity. I don't want to put, like, those organizers that they have, as nice as they are, I don't want to spend tons of time trying to fit everything back in the box. Come up with your own method. Again, I'll link in the description to my previous video to have a look at my storage solutions, how you can do it really on the cheap and really effectively. But it's what works for our group. And as part of that, use the app. I know the reason why we play board games is so that it's a tactile experience, that we love getting our hands on things. We can see a lot of people, I think for myself as well, I play miniature games as well. It's much easier to have a more holistic view of what's going on when you've got all these bits out. The problem is there can be too many bits, and having to search through the box to get the proper decks for the monsters in the scenario and shuffle those and deal with the folders or the inserts for all their cards. Like, it's really nice. It's tactile. It's fantastic. But wow, it's so much overhead. And especially as someone who is the one who is essentially adjudicating the game, who's running the app and handling all the enemy movement while playing my character, that seems to be, I feel like I'm in this DM role as well. I mean, that could be a 9.5 if you have people who are experienced in the use of the app and of the game in general. Pass that around so one person doesn't always have to do it. I don't mind doing it for our group, but I'm just saying it makes things so much faster. And of course, also doesn't take up as much real estate. It's already a big game, but I like the ability to spread out a bit and be a little more organized. So again, this is a long-term investment of your time. And if you get frustrated with having to take a lot of time setting up or tearing down the game, it's going to make it less likely you're going to get it to the table. So 100% cut down the time of that. I can setting up, of course, takes a little more time, but I tend to do it ahead of time before anybody shows up. But tearing down, it's a snap. Takes no time at all. And lastly, scenarios can be grueling. It's okay to do the Outpost phase first. So I know that, the official way is to play the scenario and then do the Outpost phase after that. But man, sometimes they go long. Some scenarios can be quite the grueling experience. Win or lose, sometimes you just don't have the energy to do so. My group seems to be fine largely doing it afterwards, but I really get the idea that, the Outpost phase, doing that first is a lot less work. It just cuts into the time of like setting up the actual scenario, because sometimes you do need to spread stuff out, especially when you get a lot of the cards for things in the Outpost. But yeah, I mean, you can 100% flip these if you're. There will come a time, I'm sure, when we've played through this game, and it's just been a grueling scenario that's taken hours and hours and hours to complete, and just kind of going, you know what, let's just hold off on doing the Outpost phase until the next time. It's perfectly okay to do that. You don't have to be beholden to what the game says. So that's it. That's well, I say it's Grizz's Blinkblade advice, but ultimately it's mine. The way the camera is positioned here, I'm sitting in her head right now. I'd like to know what your top tips and tricks are for getting more out of Frosthaven. Things you discovered in the game, maybe rules that you were surprised at to come across that you didn't know were were something that you had been playing it wrong. I'm always interested to hear where people have made those kind of oopsies, but then course corrected and learned a lot. And that's the whole point, is to learn more. And I want to learn more from you. And so that's it. Good luck out there, mercenaries. Enjoy Frosthaven. And until next time, happy gaming.